Now, a couple of final notes just to polish out this section on the Northern Renaissance. A noteworthy name that you should be familiar with is Albert Dürer. He's a German artist, printmaker, silversmith. He made jewelry and watches and stuff like that. Very talented, very good with fine detail. Notice again also a fairly smallish painting. But this particular self-portrait he did of himself is intentionally making him look fairly Christ-like. In fact, this particular gesture that you see of this hand is sometimes referred to as the Christ in Majesty. And you see all flanking the left and the right side of his head are similar visual elements that we saw in the Hans Holbein Henry VIII royal portrait. Sort of forces us to be introduced to this confrontational glare that we have here. Albert Dürer is referred to as the Michelangelo of the North. And I think that's got a lot more to do with his personality than his actual career. But he's intentionally making himself look as Christ-like as possible because he really did have a fairly massive ego. And we mentioned Martin Schongauer doing printmaking in the last presentation. Albert Dürer, also known for his prints. And just imagine how many teeny tiny little scratches into a metal plate it takes to make all of the value scales that you see here. It's very, very intricate. A lot of really minute detail. The thing that Albert Dürer and many, many, many of the Northern Renaissance counterparts that he had struggled with was the female figure. I don't know why, but for some reason they just could not quite get the proportions of the female figure right. And I understand everybody is different, but just anatomically speaking, some of the things that are happening within this female figure are kind of confusing, especially considering the level of detail and accuracy he's able to get in literally every other single element that you have presented here. That also echoes here when you see this Lucas Cranach, the Elder's Nymph of Spring. This might look familiar. You might say, hey, this looks a whole lot like the Venus of Urbino that we saw before. In fact, it's got a lot of the same color symbolism. The gesture of this reclining nude figure is sort of similar, but there are some key differences. One, that white sheet that we saw beneath the Venus of Urbino hinting at her purity is no longer there. We do have the fertility, and we do have the red for passion, but we don't have that purity because this is a nymph, and let's be honest, nymphs aren't about being pure. In place of that dog, which represented loyalty, we have two turtle doves, or love birds down here. We've got a quiver of Cupid's arrows hanging from the tree. This is all about love and passion and all of those good things. This was the Venus of Urbino with all of the unnecessary romantic pieces taken out. This is also a really good example of hyperrealism. If you look at every individual blade of grass and the leaf on every plant that you see here is very well detailed and represented. That's hyperrealism. And again, that is giving your viewers something that they can look at day after day after day. Also, really good example of how artists in the North really struggled with the female figure. It's like this shoulder just kind of emerges out of the rib cage somehow. There's just something that's just not quite right about these things. And again, the most confusing part is that there's so much detail and accuracy in everything else, but the female figure is just way off. Anyway, last thing we'll talk about here is Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. Oh, this is a controversial painting to say the least. A lot of people claim that Bosch was hallucinating. They claim that he was secretly a Satanist. They claim that he was schizophrenic and that he was having visions. None of these things are true. Not only was Hieronymus Bosch a very straight-laced guy, he was actually a deacon of the church that he went to. I doubt that he would have experimented too much with psychedelics. Doesn't seem to be any proof that he actually had any sort of mental disability. He was just a guy with a lot of time and a very active imagination who basically founded a school of art in which you take a picture plane and you pack it full of as many things as you can possibly figure out. This is just the most extreme version of everything that the Northern Renaissance has been working to in regards to finding something useful for your patronage to seek out visually. Now let me see if I can find a larger version of this that we can actually find some detail on. So the Garden of Earthly Delights is a larger altarpiece for the Northern Renaissance. This one's about 7 feet. It would have gone in a church or cathedral somewhere, but it's still not large to the same extent that we would expect to find in a large Italian fresco or something. Now, this is what it looks like when the altarpiece is closed. These are the exterior doors that cover it, and it's round like Earth. Which sort of suggests what the actual subject matter is. Once you open it, you see the 3 panels on the inside, and they're supposed to be the Garden of Eden, Earth as it existed in Hieronymus Bosch's day, which is interesting, and this is supposed to be the Hell panel. So there's 3 different worlds kind of coexisting, and each one of them has their own interesting twists. Now, I did a very dense research paper one time defending the sanity of Hieronymus Bosch using this painting. And the thing that I kept finding over and over again is that everything that you see visually conveyed here is a reference to something that would have been pop culture during that time period, or at least understood through the medieval bestiaries or through common imagery found in marginalia. But everything that you see here is a reference to something. It's not just coming from insanity or hallucination. The one theme that sort of permeates everything is just the general widespread nature that is evil. Let's see, let me pull that down. I don't want you guys all in my business. Let's see. Generally speaking, anything that is in any way unnatural is seen as being evil. All of these animals, these hybrid animals emerging from these fountains, this one specifically is supposed to be the fountain of life with all these perverse, bizarre creatures emerging from them, sort of indicates that even the Garden of Life itself has been corrupt. The Christ figure here has a slightly darker skin than your Adam and Eve figures here. A lot of people think that means that instead of this being the Christ, it's the Antichrist posing as the Christ figure. This is a reference to the Tree of Life or the Tree of Jesse. As we go up, we see there's a little owl in the Tree of Life. Owls are nocturnal animals. Nocturnal is backwards and is therefore evil. Owls are evil. The fact that these birds are climbing into this egg-shaped rock instead of emerging from an egg-shaped egg is backwards and is therefore evil. The fact that these swallows are flying out of the ground instead of landing on the ground means that they're evil. And the fact that they're flying out counterclockwise also means that it's evil. The fact that this looks like a Neolithic structure could be a reference to paganism. Paganism is also evil. Now, this is supposed to be the good one. Now, when it gets to contemporary day, Bosch, wow. He has absolutely no faith in humanity whatsoever. He sees it as a bacchanalia, an orgy. There's no restraint whatsoever. Anytime you see something that looks like a piece of fruit, it's a reference to sexuality, and these people are all about it. Down here, you might notice there's every once in a while you'll find a dark-skinned person. That's a black person in as literal as terms as he could get. As the darkest paint or darkest ink that he could find. No, that's definitely paint. These glass vessels that you see here are references to alchemy. Alchemy is something that's interfering with the will of God and is therefore unnatural and is backwards. Got another owl who's in an uncomfortable position with some guy. These birds are all referred to as birds of filth, which means that they either seek out food in the mud or they build their nest in the mud, but either way they're dirty. Like, why could an animal that could fly above us into the heavens, why would that animal choose to root around in the dirt? It's something that was seen as being a disgrace. It's unnatural and is therefore it's evil. The fact that all these people are riding these animals in a circle that's going counterclockwise is evil. And some of these people, again, I wish I could zoom in even more than this. A little bit. Doing some really interesting things. Like, this guy's always my favorite. It's like I've never ridden a horse standing up, but 1 foot, backwards. Checking yourself out is something that just, I feel is a particular skill that he has that just not many people have ever exercised. And as we get up here, it just gets more and more and more interesting, more depraved. Like instead of having the birds flying into the egg-shaped structure, you've actually got people climbing into a literal egg. These people are sort of worshiping this one strawberry-looking thing. You've got a whole population of mer people over here, sort of spread out. And then I really like, man, if anybody's got life figured out, it's this guy right here. He's on a griffin, flying through the sky, carrying a branch with a bird resting on it, and the griffin is holding a bear. This guy has really got it figured out. Everybody else, they're on their way, but man, life is chaos in the eyes of Hieronymus Bosch. Now, Hill makes things even worse. Bosch believed, like many in his day, that the punishment that you received when you got to hell was appropriate to the crime or appropriate to the sin that sent you there. So you see where a lot of people were committing things like, well, gambling and playing games of Risk, which was seen as being sinful, sexual indulgence, possibly vanity down here, playing musical instruments that weren't the gospel, playing secular music in general is something that's seen as being sinful. Oh man, just, you can pick out any tiny portion of this painting and find something really interesting. We'll work our way back down to this guy, but just look at all this. You notice that Hill has in a few places actually frozen over. This guy is tied to a massive ice skate. This guy was too, but his fell through the ice. That's because Hill was seen as being not a place of fire and brimstone necessarily, but a place that is without the light and warmth of God. And without that light and warmth, everything is cold and frozen and dark. And that's the visual that you get here. Now, this is actually a portrait of Hieronymus Bosch himself. He put himself in Hill, believing that even he, someone who is pious and holy and God-fearing, has done enough sinful act to put him in hell itself, but he makes himself part of this like tree man with this cavernous body, and there are people in here like drunkenly carousing. Up here is a bagpipe that appears to be made out of a stomach, and there are people dancing around it or being led around it counterclockwise. This is supposed to be as a reference to many things. One is just the dangerous, sinful nature of the human imagination. Also, about believing things that you hear without questioning them, bearing false prophet, things like that. There are a lot of different references that you can make with some of these things, but hell just goes on forever and ever and ever. But I promise we'd get back to this guy. This is supposed to be Beelzebub, which is not necessarily Satan, but like his regional manager in this particular case. And he's wearing a chamber pot on his head. As he's eating this person, crows are flying out of their butt. He's sitting on top of this throne wearing these ceramic vessels on his feet. And just because you've been eaten by Beelzebub doesn't mean that you've been relieved from your tenure in hell. He just defecates you out into this pit where these people are vomiting and defecating money on top of you, forever and ever and ever and ever. This is your torture. So, like I said, Hieronymus Bosch, not crazy, just really, really trying to give people a lot to focus on visually. It creates an altarpiece which could become more of a meditative tool. The fact that you can really just get lost in the visual is something to distract you from what's going on around you and allow you to focus your attention on, even if it's something like sin, if it draws your attention to the sins that you're committing and reminds you of the punishment that you might receive from it. It's a very valuable tool to have if prayer and penitence is what you're seeking out. But very popular in the Northern Renaissance because secular painting, secular artwork, artwork for private individuals, altarpieces in their homes becomes a lot more popular. The average population, the average member of Northern European culture, like they would have been slightly more wealthy than the Italian culture. Part of that's because they didn't sacrifice as much as their money to the church. The other part of that is that they were seafaring merchants, which allowed them to find creative ways to make money independently.